Hello, everyone. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That simple action helps YouTube keep showing you stories just like this one. There are stories that never made it into the history books, tales whispered only in Appalachian hollows. They are stories carried only through rumor, in trembling voices at the edge of a fire, or scratched in fading letters no one dared to read aloud. One of those stories is what I'm about to share with you. It's the kind that somehow feels undeniably true, yet too grotesque, too inhuman. The tale begins with a man whose very existence was born of something unthinkable. He was not only his mother's child, but also her lover, and he later became the father of her daughter. In those mountain towns, simply speaking his name was once enough to make a room go silent. People swore he walked like an omen. They said his eyes carried a vacancy that was not natural, as if some piece of humanity had been taken from him before he was born. In the backwoods of Appalachia, isolation was a way of life. Families clung to their land, their cabins pressed into valleys where the sun barely broke through. Outsiders rarely came knocking, and roads washed out in winter storms. In that silence, generation after generation turned inward until bloodlines folded back on themselves. This man was the most infamous product of that fold. A lineage collapsed in on itself, producing something the world was never meant to see. Fragments of his story are scattered in court records, in yellowed newspapers long buried in county archives, and in hushed accounts from old men who remembered their grandfathers warning them to stay away from the cursed house at the end of the ridge. Piece by piece, those fragments form a picture so haunting and so grotesque that, even today, the descendants of that family refuse to discuss it. What drives a family so far into secrecy and shame that they bury their children's names? What happens to a mind raised in the kind of unnatural union we're about to uncover? Tonight, we unearth the dark legacy of the man remembered only as the most inbred figure in Appalachian history. Once you hear what he became, you'll understand why the townsfolk never spoke of him again. The man's name, though rarely spoken aloud, still lingers in the brittle records of his county. But before we attach a name, we must understand the soil that bred him. Appalachia in the mid-19th century was a land of both beauty and silence. Towering mountains swallowed whole valleys, and narrow dirt paths wound through endless forests. Poverty pressed down on the families who lived there like a suffocating blanket. They relied on themselves and only themselves, which meant bloodlines rarely spread beyond the hills. Locals called it survival, but outsiders called it backward. Generations before him, the family had already begun to twist inward. Cousins married cousins, and siblings blurred into spouses. With every passing decade, the line grew thinner, weaker, stranger. In their cabin, children were born without baptism records, sometimes even without names, and without birth certificates. Their very existence was a secret. Neighbors whispered, but to step onto another family's land was to invite violence, so no one intervened. In Appalachia, the barrel of a shotgun enforced privacy. This man entered the world under that veil of silence. His father was never separate, for his father was never named. His mother carried him after already bearing his brothers, and yet those brothers were also his uncles. His family tree bent and tangled until no one could tell where one branch began and another ended. He was both son and grandson, nephew and brother. His very blood was a contradiction. From the start, there was something unsettling about him. The townsfolk described a boy who seemed less human, yet somehow older than his years. He stared too long, his words stumbled and nodded. His eyes seemed to drift into spaces no one else could see. Some blamed it on the isolation of the hills, others on what they dared not name aloud, the collapse of the bloodline itself. As he grew, his mother grew older. Neighbors expected her to fade into quiet widowhood, but instead, she drew closer to her son. Too close. Nights were said to glow from the cracks of their cabin where only two shadows moved. By the time the whispers turned into warnings, it was already too late. She bore another child. But this time, the father was not some faceless name. It was her own son. That child, his sister, his daughter, became living proof of what the family had tried to keep hidden. And with her birth, the true horror of the story began. The daughter's birth was, by all accounts, the moment the family's dark secret became impossible to ignore. Neighbors noticed the mother swelling in ways that could not be explained away by casual childbirth rumors. In those valleys, even the most private lives eventually became public knowledge because a small community cannot help but watch. And yet, when questions were raised, doors slammed shut, eyes averted, and silence fell like a funeral shroud. Inside the cabin, life took on a rhythm that outsiders could never understand. The mother and son maintained the charade of normalcy for as long as they could. They chopped their wood, tended their animals, and walked the hills as though nothing had changed. But the daughter, strangely fragile and bright-eyed, was a constant reminder of the unnatural union. Her presence became both a mark of the family's twisted lineage and a living witness. The psychological effects on the girl were profound, though subtle at first. Children born of extreme inbreeding often carry the weight of an unspoken history that shapes every interaction, not only genetic anomalies. In her, the traits of the family's twisted legacy manifested, a mix of brilliance and unease, curiosity intertwined with a primal fear. Friends and relatives who dared approach her noted a strange stillness in her gaze, as if she carried the knowledge of her origins in a language that could not be spoken. By the time the girl reached early adolescence, the full impact of the family's isolation became undeniable. She was both adored and feared by her mother and father, a child who was at once a sister and a daughter, a symbol of a bloodline collapsing under the weight of its own secrecy. The man, her father, continued to live among them, a shadow figure whose existence was both grotesque and ordinary. To the outside world, he was simply a quiet man from a remote valley. But to those within the family, he embodied a truth so damning that it could never be voiced. It was during these years that whispers began to leak beyond the cabin walls. Travelers and wandering loggers reported glimpses of a household that did not behave like any other. Strange comings and goings, odd behaviors, and a sense of dread that clung to the air became the rumors that would eventually make their way into court records decades later. People instinctively recoiled from the house on the ridge, unsure of what evil might dwell within, yet unable to resist the pull of curiosity. And in that tension between isolation and exposure, secrecy and suspicion, the family's history continued to unfold quietly, dangerously, and inexorably toward its inevitable confrontation with the outside world. As the daughter grew, the man's presence in the valley became increasingly unsettling. Locals who had once avoided the family entirely began to take notice of subtle signs that something was deeply wrong. Livestock disappeared without explanation. Windows were boarded at odd angles. Even the sunlight seemed to avoid the cabin that perched like a shadow at the end of the ridge. There were nights when travelers claimed to hear voices, hushed, tense, unbroken by laughter or play, echoing across the hills, only to vanish when investigated. Inside the home, the father-daughter relationship continued under a veneer of normalcy, but the psychological cost was enormous. The daughter was taught obedience, not love, knowledge, but not understanding. Every word, every glance, every gesture was measured and constrained by the family's twisted code. She was both student and ward, child and sibling, constantly reminded of the unnatural hierarchy she could not escape. In her eyes, generations of secrecy and shame pressed like an invisible weight, forming a mind attuned to survival, yet haunted by an instinctual awareness of taboo. The mother, too, became a figure of obsession. She oscillated between devotion and control, domineering yet protective, fully aware of the moral and social boundaries she had crossed, but powerless to reverse them. Her life had become a closed loop, a system of rituals and rules designed to keep outsiders from discovering the truth. Visitors were greeted with stories of other families in need or misdirected by feigned normality. And the local community, accustomed to respecting boundaries in isolated valleys, often let the family exist in quiet ignorance, never questioning the rhythms that seemed so unnatural. Yet nature has a way of exposing what the mountains try to hide. Inbreeding compounded across generations produced not only psychological strain but also physical anomalies. Some children carried subtle deformities. Others exhibited peculiar behaviors. And when the daughter reached adolescence, it became impossible to ignore the fact that the genetic consequences of the family's unions were more than mere rumor. People whispered that she bore a resemblance to multiple generations at once, as though her face carried the ghostly echoes of every ancestor folded into one fragile human frame. The outside world began to edge closer. Land disputes, court records, and the arrival of outsiders to the valley brought attention that the family could no longer fully resist. What had been contained by the hills, hidden by silence and fear, was now beginning to be observed, catalogued, and recorded. And with that scrutiny came judgment, both moral and legal, which the family had long anticipated, yet had been powerless to forestall. By now, the story of the man and his daughter had grown into a legend, not one told for amusement, but for warning. Those who knew even fragments of the truth spoke in hushed tones, careful never to repeat the story aloud, yet never able to forget it. And the family, trapped between secrecy and exposure, teetered on the brink of a revelation that would haunt them forever. By the time the daughter was in her late teens, the consequences of her bloodline could no longer be ignored. Her mind was sharp, almost unnaturally so, yet fragile under the pressure of the family's twisted dynamics. She carried the weight of an entire lineage, the knowledge of taboo encoded in every gesture, every glance she had ever witnessed. It was as if she could feel the judgment of generations past, a legacy of secrecy pressing down on her young shoulders. Outside the cabin, rumors grew. Travelers passing through the valley spoke of a household that seemed frozen in time, as though untouched by the moral constraints of the outside world. They whispered of the strange figure of the man, her father, who roamed the ridges at dusk, his eyes distant, haunted, as if carrying knowledge too horrific for ordinary men. Some claimed they saw him tending to animals alone, murmuring to them as if they were the only creatures capable of understanding him. Others swore that shadows moved unnaturally in the cabin's windows, bending in ways the human body should not allow. The daughter's adolescence became a crucible of conflicting forces. She loved her mother, feared her father, and loathed herself in ways she could never articulate. The cabin, meant to be a sanctuary, had become a prison. The isolation that had protected the family for generations now served as a cage, cutting them off from any possibility of escape or intervention. And yet there were moments of quiet rebellion, a glance toward the woods, a fleeting smile at strangers, a question whispered under the breath of night that hinted at a desire to break free from the cycle that had ensnared them. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The question is not just theoretical. For this daughter, it was the reality she could not escape. Every decision, every interaction, every heartbeat was bound by the invisible threads of a family secret that had grown monstrous over the decades. Eventually, the consequences of isolation and inbreeding began to manifest physically. She, like many before her in the family, displayed traits that were troubling and unusual. There were deformities, yes, but also behaviors that set her apart, an almost preternatural awareness of her surroundings, a mind capable of calculating consequences before they occurred, and a gaze that seemed to pierce through deception. The town whispered of her, but fear and respect kept most at a distance. And yet, within the walls of the cabin, the horror was fully human. The daughter, her father, and her mother continued their lives, bound together in a pattern that was as grotesque as it was inescapable. A living testament to the destructive force of isolation, secrecy, and bloodline obsession. Eventually, the outside world began to encroach more aggressively. Land surveys, legal disputes, and the occasional curious traveler peeled back the isolation that had protected the family for generations. Authorities stumbled upon evidence that was as shocking as it was undeniable, testimonies, records, and artifacts that pointed to unions so unnatural they defied social and biological norms. The man, once just a shadow in the hills, became a symbol of a hidden nightmare. For the daughter, this intrusion was catastrophic. The fragile equilibrium of her life shattered under scrutiny. The psychological walls her family had built could not contain the weight of judgment. The knowledge that what had been hidden in the shadows was now being recorded, documented, and analyzed. Court documents and letters surfaced. Each one was a relic of secrecy, exposing details no one in that valley had dared speak aloud for decades. Suddenly, the cabin's isolation was meaningless. The mountains could not shield them from the world's gaze. Medical observers, when finally able to examine her, noted the physical consequences of generations of inbreeding. She carried traits from multiple ancestors, some pronounced, others subtle, and the genetic strain was clear in her form and function. By now, the story had begun to enter the broader folklore of the region. Elders spoke of the family in low tones, warning children never to venture near the ridge, to respect the shadows, and to remember that some secrets were best left buried. And buried they were, in the soil of Appalachia, in the memories of those who dared not speak, and in the invisible threads connecting the family to a past that refused to die. The legacy of the most inbred man in Appalachian history was no longer just his story. It was a cautionary tale. It illustrated the tragic outcomes of generations closed off from the world, the consequences of secrecy, and the extremes of human isolation. And though decades have passed, the valley still remembers, silently and insistently, the man and his daughter whose lives were entwined in ways that the outside world can scarcely comprehend. Time, as it always does, moved forward, yet the shadow of this family never fully lifted from the valley. Descendants of the daughter grew up carrying fragments of the story, though most were never told the full truth. It became a whispered history, a family secret spoken only in fragments, a cautionary tale, often with shame in the heart and fear in the voice. The cabin eventually decayed, the ridge returned to forest, and the mountains seemed to swallow the story whole, but it never truly disappeared. What remains most haunting is not the physical evidence, nor the documents, nor even the grotesque reality of the family tree. It is the psychological imprint left behind. The daughter, shaped by the weight of secrecy and unnatural bonds, became a mirror reflecting the extremes of human isolation, obsession, and denial. Her life illustrates a chilling truth, that darkness can thrive in ways almost impossible to imagine when humanity is removed from the most basic social structures: love, community, guidance. For those outside the family, the story serves as both morbid curiosity and warning. It is a reminder of what happens when generations are cut off from the world, when the natural course of life is corrupted by secrecy and fear, and when shame is internalized rather than confronted. And yet there is something undeniably human about the tale. A reflection of our own vulnerabilities, the fragile nature of morality when isolated from society, and our capacity for denial. Historians who have studied the valley emphasize one point. The story of the most inbred man in Appalachian history is not merely an anecdote of grotesque behavior. It is a case study in the consequences of secrecy, both genetic and psychological, and the extremes of human isolation. Every whispered rumor, every record buried in county archives, every shadowed glance across the ridge contributes to a mosaic of horror that is at once personal and universal. As we leave the story behind, it is important to remember the human element within this history. This was not a myth, not a cautionary tale invented for thrill seekers. It was a life lived, a family shaped by extremes, and a society that turned away, choosing silence over intervention. The mountains keep their secrets, but the truth has a way of lingering, of echoing across time, reminding us of the fragility of civilization and the darkness that can grow in its absence. And so the ridge stands empty now. Yet the story of the man, his mother, and their daughter endures, an echo of forbidden history that challenges us to look, to question, and to confront the uncomfortable truths buried deep within the dust.